how do you connect the dots? There's a relationship between these two subject areas, and well, there's some things that's, first of all, they are obviously very different, evolution and history and politics, but some things we do see that they have in common is that both have a profound impact on our culture. We think about our origins as a man, and we believe about politics and our history both profoundly affect our culture. And as Ed was just pointing out now, evolution, as we've seen tonight, really is a myth, but it's been accepted as a fact. It's been repeated so often and stated as a fact. And likewise, there are certain myths about politics and history that are accepted as fact because they've been repeated over and over again and not challenged. One other thing I might just see that's kind of the common denominator is this, that evolutionists explain things as happening by chance. Likewise, there are some historians, we might call establishment historians, who explain certain events in our history as happening by chance or accident and not occurring by design. And what do I mean by that? I'd like to start with the Vietnam War, which we're all very familiar with. It's probably safe to say that, well, it's arguable, but perhaps the Vietnam War impacted our culture more than any other event in the 20th century. And here's how the establishment historians, well, who I mean by establishment historians, people like David Halberstam and Arthur Schlesinger Jr. and Stephen B. Ambrose and your Book of the Month Club type of historians will explain the war in Vietnam. They'll say that, well, it was a quagmire. It was a result of a series of blundering decisions. See, the military gave bad advice to our government. Military underestimated the patriotic fervor of the Vietnamese people, and we committed more and more troops and got deeper and deeper into that war, and then we just couldn't extricate ourselves. It was just a quagmire. Nobody could do anything about it, just an accident of history. In fact, I did a word search a couple nights ago, and I found that, on the internet, found that the word quagmire in Vietnam are paired more than 10,000 times. Just a favorite establishment word to explain that. But if you look at Vietnam, you notice some odd things. One thing, let's go back to World War II for a minute. Now, World War II, we fought a two-front war against two mighty empires, the German military machine and the Japanese military machine. And let's face it, those were tough armies, right? I mean, they had well-equipped armies, navies, air forces, and their soldiers were tough, right? The United States was able to defeat them on two fronts in just 3.5 years with the help of our allies. Yet in over 10 years, we were unable to defeat little old North Vietnam. Now, why was that? Back in 1968, a group of retired military officers pointed out that the war in Vietnam could be won in about 6 months. So what you ought to do, first of all, you need to blockade Haiphong Harbor. That's where they're getting 80 to 90% of their supplies. And don't bomb the Ho Chi Minh Trail if you want to stop the flow of supplies. Send the U.S. Marines in there and blockade that thing. And take off the restrictions on the Air Force. Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense, was denying, back in the mid-'60s, 94% of the strategic targets the Air Force wanted to bomb, he would not permit. But not just that. There were what they called the rules of engagement in Vietnam. Those were not declassified until 1985, when it took 26 pages of fine print in the Congressional Record to summarize them. Troops were given orders not to fire upon the enemy until they were fired upon. Service to air missiles, launch sites could not be bombed while they were under construction. You had to wait until they're actually fully operational. If you saw an enemy MiG on the ground, you couldn't bomb it. You had to wait until it was in the air and demonstrating hostile intent. The enemy was allowed free sanctuary in Cambodia, and many other restrictions were placed on our military. Now, how about World War II? We didn't fight like that. No holds barred. In World War II, did we say, hey, look, there's 100 Luftwaffe fighters down there, but we can't bomb them because they're not in the air and they're not showing hostile intent. If we fought World War II like we fought Vietnam, we would have lost World War II. So we didn't fight with those kind of rules of engagement. Now, when I was a hippie, an atheist and leftist back in the late 60s, early 70s, what we were told was that the Vietnam War was started by a bunch of right-wing, conservative, patriotic, anti-communist types. I just want to look for a moment at the man who actually got us into Vietnam and see if that is true, because that's what a lot of people still believe. When did we first make a decision to send any troops to Vietnam? It was in late 1961 when President Kennedy authorized sending up 10,000 troops to Vietnam. Now, he did that on the advice of Walt Rostow of the State Department, who had just returned from a fact-finding mission from Vietnam. Who was Walt Rostow? Son of a communist revolutionary in Russia. He tried 3 times to get into the State Department during the Eisenhower administration, was rejected every time as a security risk. 2 members of his family were members of the Communist Party. His brother, Eugene Debs Rostow, was named for the Socialist Party leader, Eugene Debs. Not the kind of a guy you would classify as an anti-communist. Was he a nationalist? Was he a patriot? Here's what he wrote in 1960, the year before he made this recommendation for sending troops to Vietnam. In his book, The United States in the World Arena, he wrote, quote, "It is a legitimate American national objective to see removed from all nations, including the United States, the right to use substantial military force to pursue their own interests. Since this right is the root of national sovereignty, it is therefore an American interest to see an end to nationhood as it has been historically defined," unquote. Those are not the words of a patriot or nationalist. By the way, you know how the American establishment got Rostow into the State Department finally, under Kennedy? They had to fire Otto Otepka, the head of security for the U.S. State Department. If you want to read a book all about that, read a book called The Ordeal of Otto Otepka by William J. Gill. Now, when did we make the commitment to forcefully, substantially intervene in Vietnam? It came after the Tonkin Gulf incident, and we passed the Tonkin Gulf resolution where Congress gave the president those powers to intervene. A couple of anomalies. Now, supposedly in the Tonkin Gulf incident, North Vietnamese torpedo boats fired on U.S. destroyers. But James Stockdale, Navy pilot and winner of the Congressional Medal of Honor, overflew that area for 1.5 hours at the time of the supposed attack, and he reports there were no North Vietnamese torpedo boats in the area. And you can read about that in his book called In Love and War. Another big anomaly to the Tonkin Gulf resolution is that the resolution was written before the Tonkin Gulf incident happened. It was a resolution waiting for an incident to be created. Now, who authored that resolution? The man who wrote the resolution was William P. Bundy. Now, who was he? Well, later on, he would become editor of Foreign Affairs, the Journal of the Council on Foreign Relations, which I'll be talking about tonight. You know, back in the 1950s, he was head of the Alger Hiss Defense Fund. You know, Alger Hiss was a Soviet spy. Of course, he denied it at the time, but now it's been confirmed by the Venona tapes and KGB archives that have been opened. You know, an anti-communist does not become head of a defense fund for a Soviet spy. But when did we make the decision to really, really escalate the war in Vietnam? It was 1965. Lyndon Baines Johnson made that decision to start sending hundreds of thousands of troops to Vietnam. Why did that happen? Well, unknown to the public, there was a meeting at the White House between President Johnson and a group of advisors that the public didn't know about. 14 advisors. They were informally nicknamed the Wise Men. The head of the group was Dean Acheson. The Wise Men told President Johnson he must escalate the war in Vietnam. He himself had been very reluctant to do it. But leading the charge, insisting that the war in Vietnam must be escalated, was Dean Acheson. Now, who is Dean Acheson? Well, back in the Truman State Department, when he was Secretary of State, he surrounded himself with more than a dozen members of the U.S. Communist Party. He promoted John Stewart's service even after service was caught passing secrets to foreign agents. You know, we didn't recognize the Soviet Union until 1933. But even before that, Joseph Stalin picked Dean Acheson to represent Soviet interests in the United States. Now, how did he happen to pick Dean Acheson? Well, the late Gary Allen had an explanation for that. He said that Stalin got a hold of the New York Yellow Pages, and he opened up to attorneys, and he closed his eyes, and he put his finger down, and his finger just happened to fall on the name of Dean Acheson. When Communist Poland was having trouble getting recognized by the United States government because of its human rights abuses, who did they recruit? The law firm of Dean Acheson. When Arthur Bliss Lane, our ambassador to Poland, heard that Dean Acheson had become Secretary of State, he said, "God help the United States of America." Who was his law partner? Dean Acheson's law partner was Donald Hiss, the brother of Alger Hiss, the Soviet spy. Anti-communist? I don't think so. Oh, by the way, you know what his son-in-law was? Son-in-law was William P. Bundy, the guy who drafted the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. So it's a very tight little clique that got us into Vietnam. And if you want to know something else interesting, this tight little clique that got us into Vietnam also authored those rules of engagement that prevented us from winning in Vietnam. If you look at these guys, you'll find that they, most of them had a common denominator, which was membership in the Council on Foreign Relations. And actually, in my book, The Shadows of Power, got a book of President Johnson meeting with his advisors in Vietnam, and every one of the advisors, it's a big group, every one of them a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. And I was a hippie in the 60s, late 60s, early 70s. We used to say, you know, hey man, you know, it's the establishment that's really running everything in America. Now, hippies knew a little bit about America, you know, and they were right. The establishment did run America, but they had a wrong idea of the character of the establishment. Now, what is the establishment? You know, it's kind of a nebulous idea. Rich people who run things behind the scenes. If you're looking to put a face on the establishment, a real face on it, you can take a look at the membership roster, the historic membership roster of the Council on Foreign Relations, which you might call the bridge of influence between the establishment and the American government. Now, what is the Council? Well, the best way to characterize it would be it's an organization that advocates world government. Let's back that up. A few quotes. The Reese Committee of Congress, when it investigated tax-free foundations, said that the Council's, quote, productions are not objective, but are directed overwhelmingly at promoting the globalist concept, unquote. Admiral Chester Ward, former Judge Advocate General of the U.S. Navy, himself a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, said this: the Council has as its goal, quote, submergence of U.S. sovereignty into an all-powerful world government. This lust to surrender the sovereignty and independence of the United States is pervasive throughout most of the membership. In the entire CFR lexicon, there is no term of revulsion carrying a meaning so deep as America First, unquote. In the Boston Herald, editorial, August 27th, 1996, called the Council on Foreign Relations, quote, foreign policy fuzzy thinkers who worship world government, unquote. And many other quotes could be given, and I have many in my book from the Council itself that substantiate that. Now, you might wonder, well, what's wrong with the New World Order anyway? What's wrong with world government anyhow? Because what the globalists say is this: well, look, there's nothing worse in the world than war, right? And the only reason we have wars is because the world is divided into separate countries. Now, if we just dissolved all the national boundaries and we all lived under one world government, there'd be no war, and we'd all be happy. It's kind of like John Lennon. We've seen, he said that song, Imagine there's no countries and no religion too. I mean, that's the globalist concept, you know, that there would be no countries and this big ideal we'd have peace. You know what? A study was done of deaths in the 20th century. You know what they found? It found that 4 times more people were killed by their own governments than died in wars. Governments are actually more dangerous than wars are. And if you do have one government running the whole world, a big question is, who's going to run this government? You know, globalists will say, look, national coalitions are good. National coalitions defeated Hitler, right? Okay, but what happens if Hitler takes over world government? Where are you going to run? Who's going to run this world government? Well, if you want to get a good idea, take a look at the European Union. Ed, you told me that the European Union now is making a law for every country. It's against the law to spank children, isn't that right? European Union, if an individual country has an anti-abortion statute, it's forced to repeal it under the force of the European Union. In Norway now, they're making it an imprisonable offense to quote scripture that denounces homosexuality. Many more examples could be given. But clearly, the people who advocate globalization and world government are not conservative Christian types, if you're wondering who's going to run this world government. Now, earlier we were talking about why it was that we haven't had any dictatorships here in America. And you know, the founding fathers of this country knew what they were doing. They divided power. They know if you centralize power, it'll be abused. So they didn't just give us, of course, you know this, but they didn't give us just an executive. They gave us a Congress as a check and balance on the president. And within the Congress, there was a check and balance between the House and the Senate. And on top of that, they gave us the Supreme Court, which was supposed to oversee the executive and the legislature to make sure they were sticking to the Constitution. And on top of that, the states, as originally conceived of by the founding fathers, were supposed to counteract the balance of the federal government and act as another check on power. You know something? The nations of the world themselves act as a check and balance system. If one nation becomes too evil, people can flee from it to another country can stop it. But if we have one world government and that government goes evil, who can save us from that? Now, what about the Council on Foreign Relations? Where did it come from? Well, in 1919, the victorious Allies were meeting in Paris to decide how they were going to carve up Germany and get reparations from it. And Woodrow Wilson came to that conference with a group of globalists, internationalists, a lot of them from the American banking community. And of course, he brought to that conference his famous plan for the League of Nations, which was a rudimentary plan for world government. But what a lot of people don't know is that he wasn't the one who came up with that plan. It's actually developed by his advisor, Colonel Edward Mandell House, his closest advisor, who's the unseen hand behind the Federal Reserve Act, and a front man for the international banking establishment. House's biographer, Charles Seymour, wrote this, quote, Wilson approved the House draft almost in its entirety, and his own rewriting of it was practically confined to phraseology. we're talking about when he says it's House draft, we're talking about the plan, the covenant for the League of Nations. Ray Stannard Baker, who was Wilson's official biographer, said this, quote, "Practically nothing, not a single idea in the covenant of the League was original with the president," unquote. It was the bankers in Colonel House that came up with that idea. Well, the League of Nations was created, but the United States did not join. The United States refused to ratify the Versailles Treaty out of Paris. And some of you might have read that excellent article by Jack McManus a few months ago in the New American about the 16 irreconcilables in the Senate who refused to ratify that treaty. Well, when word got back to Paris that the United States wasn't going to join the League of Nations, Colonel House and the other internationalists who had come out with him and Wilson held a series of meetings at the Majestic Hotel. And they resolved to form a new organization that would change the climate of opinion in America so that Americans would accept world government. And that organization was incorporated as the Council on Foreign Relations in New York City in 1921. That was its purpose and why it came into being. Of course, that's not what it said in its official announcement. It said, quote, "It is simply," this is 1922, it said, "it is simply a group of men concerned in spreading a knowledge of international relations, and in particular in developing a reasoned foreign policy," unquote. J.P. Morgan poured millions of dollars into this organization so we could have a reasoned foreign policy, but to him and to the bankers, that meant global government. Now, how does the Council on Foreign Relations influence our foreign policy? Well, there's several ways. One is through its publications, its influential journal Foreign Affairs, its papers, and the books that it publishes. Also through its interlocks with the media. If you look at the board of directors of major TV networks and Washington Post, major establishment publications, you'll find interlocks between those people and the Council on Foreign Relations. Of course, Dan Rather and Tom Brokaw are members of the Council on Foreign Relations. Also, academia. You'll find that a lot of CFR members, Council on Foreign Relations members, are also on the boards of major foundations which grant money to universities. And by granting money to those universities, they can influence what is taught in colleges. But the main method of influence is by directly supplying cabinet-level officials to our government. When I wrote the Shadows of Power back in 1987, we were amazed. We looked back through the roll. We found that from that time, going back to the days of FDR, virtually every Secretary of State, every Secretary of Defense, and every Secretary of Treasury have been drawn from the ranks of the Council on Foreign Relations, regardless of whether it's the Democrats or the Republicans in the White House. Now, what are some examples, real examples of how the Council on Foreign Relations has influenced American foreign policy? Let's take 3 examples from right after World War II. United Nations. Now, when I went to school, here's how my teacher explained the United Nations. He said, well, look, after World War II, boys and girls, all the nations of the world were really sick of war, so they decided to get together, and they formed this organization that they hoped would stop war. But where it really began was in the intellects of the Council on Foreign Relations. There was a group of CFR members called the Informal Agenda Group, which came up with the idea, coined the term United Nations, proposed it to FDR for his approval. And at the founding conference in San Francisco of the United Nations, more than 40 of the American delegates were members of the Council on Foreign Relations, CFR for short. How about the Marshall Plan, our plan for aid to Europe? Now, what history books will tell you is this. Well, look, back in 1947, General George Marshall had an idea it would be great to start sending aid to Europe, and so he announced that in a commencement speech at Harvard. You know what? Didn't have anything to do with Marshall at all. The plan for the Marshall Plan was actually developed at a study group of the Council on Foreign Relations, was chaired by David Rockefeller. And originally they were going to call it the Truman Plan, and they wanted President Truman to announce it. But then they realized if Truman announces it, the Republicans ain't going to support it. So they decided to have a general announce the plan, because they figured a general would get bipartisan support, and he did. And that's the inside story behind the Marshall Plan. How about the World Bank and the IMF? They were started at the Bretton Woods Conference. Yeah, but that's not where they really started. The original plan came from the War and Peace Studies Project of the Council on Foreign Relations. World Bank is presented to the public as sort of a charitable institution. It goes out when poor countries are in trouble. It gives them money to get them out of trouble. But you know what? It's really a system of loan guarantees for the bankers who designed it. See, what happens is, if one of the big banks down in New York City makes loans to Argentina, and Argentina can't pay, defaults on the loan, World Bank takes money from the U.S. taxpayer, gives it to Argentina, Argentina gives it to the bankers. Pretty clever plan. I wouldn't call that a charitable institution. What about today, though? What's going on today? how is the Council on Foreign Relations influencing foreign policy today, and what's in store? There's two areas I'd like to look at. And one reason why I'd like to look at these areas is because these are areas that conservatives are often fooled on. Now, one thing I find about the American establishment is, in a spiritual context, Satan may be evil, but he's not stupid. And these people in the American establishment are not stupid. They've got conservatives pretty well taped and measured, and they know how to get the support of conservatives when they want it. Two things we look at are trade and the war on terrorism. Now, trade, that gives you a headache when you think about economics, right? I mean, one reason people are easily fooled on the subject of evolution is they think, well, it's science and it's too complicated to think about. Economics is kind of like that. People think, well, economics is just over my head. That's one reason why people get tricked on some of the economic issues. Now, back in 1994, when the GATT Treaty was up for a vote before Congress, the General Agreement on Trades and Tariffs, I was writing an article for a major conservative magazine on it, and I was absolutely astounded at the confusion in Congress over support for this issue. Normally, on any issue, liberals and conservatives know where they stand. Abortion, the liberals on one side and the conservatives on the other. School prayer, liberals on one side, conservatives on the other. Cats versus dogs, meow meow versus woof woof, and everybody knows where they stand. But it's amazing, during the GATT Treaty, they did this potpourri. Who was leading the fight to support the GATT Treaty in the House? It was Phil Crane. Now, Phil Crane, probably about the most conservative guy in the House of Representatives, at least at that time. But who else was gung-ho for the GATT Treaty? Ted Kennedy and Al Gore. How did those guys agree on anything? Now, over on the other side of Congress, who was dead against the GATT Treaty? Jesse Helms. Jesse Helms, probably the most conservative senator, right, in the U.S. Senate. But who led the fight against the GATT in the House? Marcy Kaptur of Ohio. And she had a 0 rating in the conservative index of the John Birch Society. Her voting record was 0 on conservative votes, but she was standing shoulder to shoulder with Jesse Helms fighting the GATT Treaty. There was this total confusion. Well, why did you have all this confusion? Well, I'm going to simplify a little bit, but basically, the American establishment, which was behind the GATT Treaty, figured out how to trick the American conservative. And their argument was this: well, look, you're in favor of free enterprise, right? Oh, yeah. Well, if you're in favor of free enterprise, you're in favor of free trade, right? Yeah. Well, look, this GATT Treaty is going to knock down all these trade barriers between countries. We'll have free enterprise the world over. We'll be able to export to countries all around the world. America will know untold prosperity. Well, that's a conservative's dream, free enterprise and prosperity. And conservatives went along with it. Well, I submitted my article to this magazine, and the magazine editor told me, Jim, we're not publishing your article. I said, you're not? He said, no. I said, what's wrong with it? He said, well, Jim, you know what your article does? Jim, I'm surprised you can even call yourself a conservative. Now, your article says that America should keep these tariffs that the GATT Treaty is going to knock down. Now, Jim, I have to explain the basics, I see, of economics to you. See, now, Jim, a tariff is government interference with the marketplace. That's socialism, Jim. This magazine does not sell socialism. So you're going to have to take your socialist goods and peddle them somewhere else. Now, that's not an exact quote. That's just a paraphrase. But this is a subject I'm sure a lot of you weren't expecting me to get into tonight. But I made a point to this person that he couldn't get, but I bet that a lot of you will. Now, suppose you're a businessman down here in Albany. You own a business here. Do you have the right to ask the police to protect your business from thieves, vandals, terrorists, and rioters? Do you have that right? Yeah. Does that make you a socialist if you do that? But the police are a government agency, and you're asking to protect you. Well, let me tell you something else. You're not a socialist if you ask the government to protect you from vandals and thieves and rioters. And you're also not a socialist if you ask your government to erect a tariff to protect your business from being raided by cheap slave labor imports from communist and socialist countries. Now, at the time I had this, I know this is controversial among conservatives, but at the time I was talking to this editor. I said, I was talking to William J. Gelt, president of the American Coalition for Competitive Trade. This is 1994, and I said, he predicts if we knock down those trade barriers with a GATT, what's going to happen? He says that we're going to have a flood of foreign imports into this country, and our industry is going to start moving overseas, and we see our industry wiped out. The editor told me, Jim, that is not going to happen. I said, why not? He says, Jim, American people aren't going to buy cheap imports. The American people are always going to choose good old-fashioned American quality over those cheap imports. And he accused me of being unpatriotic. He said, Jim, are you trying to tell me that the socialist countries can outperform America, that they make better quality products than we do here? And of course, I don't believe that. I think we make the best quality products in the world here in America. But you know what? People don't just buy in quality, they buy on price. And if a housewife goes to Walmart, she's got a plastic container made in America, costs $5.80. And she's got one here made in China, costs $1.30. That one from America may be prettier, maybe a little sturdier, but 9 times out of 10, she's going to choose that cheap $1.30 import. You know something? That's the story of what's happened to our textile industry, our steel industry, electronics industry, wiped out by cheap imports. Now, who was right in this? Did the Americans start to buy the cheap imports? You bet they did. The year that the GATT Treaty passed, our trade deficit jumped from $75 billion to $108 billion, new all-time record. $108 billion was an all-time record in 1994. You know what the trade deficit was last year? $503 billion, up 28% from the year before. We're not exporting, we are importing. Now, some of you may be thinking this. George Will, who stumped for the GATT Treaty at the time, said, look, tariffs are a tax on all Americans. It's an unnecessary element of our economy. Some people think, well, look, it's unfair to make the American housewife pay extra for those imports from China. No, you're hurting the economy. If she has to pay more for that import from China, she has less money to spend on other things. You're hurting the American economy. I'll tell you something. A tariff is not a tax on Americans. You know what? Tariffs take away tax from Americans. Do you know how this country survived before the income tax was instituted in 1912? Our government survived on tariff revenues. The Founding Fathers didn't have an income tax. They made other countries pay at the gate to get into the economy that they all wanted to get into. Now, here's something else. In 1994, when the GATT Treaty was passed, Congress had to waive $33 billion that year in tariff revenues. You know who made it up? The American taxpayers made up that $33 billion. Now, I'll tell you something else. If you lose your job to foreign imports, even if you've got money left to buy that cheap thing from China. If your neighbor who's lost his job, if your neighbor still keeps his job, he has to work much harder now. He has to raise his taxes to pay for you if you're on unemployment. You know something? The Founding Fathers of America, George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson, they were protectionists. They believed in protecting the American economy, and they erected a tariff structure under which our economy thrived. You know who advocated free trade? Karl Marx, Colonel House, and the Council on Foreign Relations. In fact, when I wrote The Shadows of Power, I noticed something real interesting. I noticed that on the back of every issue of the Foreign Affairs, their journal, for years, the picture of a roller coaster, and there would be an ad advocating free trade. So when I was at the John Birch Society, I used to work at that, and when I was up at Belmont, I used to work in the research department. I said, hey guys, isn't it kind of funny that the Council on Foreign Relations advocates free trade, and we're advocating free trade? And I think people just thought, well, I guess, the CFR just got this one right. I guess they're just doing a good deed in this case. Well, no, I don't think so. I think they knew exactly what they were going to do to the American economy. Now, I can hear somebody maybe say this. Well, look, Jim, you say that George Washington favored tariffs and Karl Marx was a free trader. Well, what about Adam Smith, the founder of modern capitalism? Didn't he advocate free trade? That's right. But you know something? When Adam Smith wrote about free trade, you know what he's talking about? He's talking about free trade between free countries. I believe in free trade, too, if it's between free countries. What I don't believe in is free trade between free countries and communist and socialist countries. See, when Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations, they didn't have any communist countries in those days, so it didn't figure into his equation. Now, if you can make that distinction between free trade and free trade between free countries and free trade in communist nations, you can avoid the trap by which the establishment has tricked the American conservative. They're two different things. Now, if you still think that the GATT Treaty might be a good deal for America, I want to point something out. In 1994, when we passed the GATT Treaty, you know how many votes in the World Trade Organization Europe got? 30 votes. You know how many votes Africa got? 35. You know how many votes America got? We got one vote. One vote. We have as much voting power in the World Trade Organization as the Maldives. That's a little country with a population of 230,000. Let me ask you something. Suppose you were the the president of IBM, the CEO of IBM, and you have a meeting with your stockholders. You say, look, I've just made a great deal for IBM. I'm forming a joint merger. We're forming a joint merger with some other companies. And they say, what are the companies? 4 or 5 little mom and pop businesses, each have assets of about $10,000. But, to make this deal, I did have to give them equal voting power. So in the future, they will control IBM. And the shareholders of IBM say, well, why did you do that? Well, I said, well, I figured, well, look, we're one company, they're one company, one vote, right? That's fair. Now, how would this shareholders react to the head of IBM told me he made a deal like that? Pretty angry, right? But that's the deal that Bill Clinton cut for us when he railroaded the GATT Treaty through the Congress in 1994. Now,
how about NAFTA?
NAFTA is part of that picture, and we'll be touching on that. Now, you might wonder, what's all got to do with this Council on Foreign Relations? Well, I'd like to quote someone on that who really would know, and that's Senator Ernest Hollings of South Carolina. And the reason he would know, he chaired the Senate Commerce Committee, and he held 45 days of hearings on the GATT Treaty before the Senate voted on it. And the CFR sent guys down like Felix Rohatyn, who stood there and said, oh, Senator, we're not losing our jobs to imports. It's just advances in technology, nothing to do with imports. Well, here's what Senator Hollings said on the floor of the Senate at the time of the vote. Quote, he's talking about multinational corporations and banks. He says, quote, they got the Trilateral Commission and the Council on Foreign Relations up there in New York. If you ever run for president, they'll invite you. When you come at their invitation, what they'll do is they'll want you to swear on the altar of free trade, all might have faith forever and ever. Are you a free trader? Yeah, I'm for free trade. That's all they want. You can get out, you can get their contributions, you can get their support. I've been there, and I know what I am talking about. But that is what our friend David Rockefeller and his Trilateral Commission and all that got that steam together. It's not about jobs, it's about money. Well, they are getting rich, and we are losing jobs. They are debilitating and destroying us. Unquote. Senator Ernest Hollings. I happen to have that quote because I taped those hearings on CNN. Now, you might ask, well, what's this got to do with world government? How's that going to lead us to world government? Well, look at the European Union right now. European Union, they got a common currency. They're going to build a European Pentagon, consolidate all their military. A child today in Belgium is not taught that he's a child of Belgium. He or she is taught that there are children of the European Union, children of Europe. How did it all get started? With an economic alliance called the Common Market in 1957. What happens is, once you form an economic alliance, you find you have conflicts. One country says to another, well, look, our farmers are rioting because your goods are cheaper than ours. And you know what else? We can accept your goods. They don't measure up to our safety standards. But of course, if we had common laws to regulate all this, we wouldn't have these conflicts. And we have differences on tax structure. We have different rules on relationship with trade unions. We have all these conflicts, environmental standards. The only way for us to resolve this, we should have a parliament, a common parliament. We could have common laws to regulate this and resolve all these conflicts. And so they went from the common market in 57 to the European Parliament in 79 to the European Union today. Let's see where we are in time. We're after 10 o'clock. Ed, how late should we safely run tonight? 10:15, okay. When you give up sovereignty into one of these organizations, you find you start having to do the things that that organization wants. For example, recently, the World Trade Organization slapped $4 billion in sanctions on the United States because they didn't like our tax structure. They said we're giving our companies too good of a break. So the Bush administration has told the World Trade Organization it will begin to restructure our taxes to meet their demands. Join up with one of these organizations and you find you start losing your sovereignty. And you were talking about NAFTA. That's right, NAFTA is the beginning of the same plan for the Americas. They also are proposing now the Free Trade Area of the Americas, FTAA. And of course, what they envision is eventually this will lead to a common parliament and some type of European Union here in the West. And eventually, these organizations will be consolidated into one world government. That is the plan, to take it by stepping stones. Well, let's talk about one other thing, the war on terror. I want to say at the outset, I'm 100% behind our troops, as I know you are. And Ed, who's put this together for us, his son is a captain over there right now in the Middle East. But I think we can be behind our troops and still question the wisdom of political decisions that are made. What I'd like to do is put this in the context of history. At the outset, I talked about the Gulf of Tonkin and how the Gulf of Tonkin resolution was actually written before the Gulf of Tonkin took place. You know, there's been other incidents like that in our history. I know many of you have read my articles on Pearl Harbor in the New American, where we discussed the fact that FDR had full knowledge of the Pearl Harbor attack, and as did Chief of Staff General George Marshall, but they withheld that from our Hawaiian commanders. How did they know? Well, they knew from the fact that they were decoding the Japanese diplomatic intercepts on a same-day basis. FDR had the declaration of war of Japan on December the 6th, the day before it was given to Secretary of State Cordell Hull by Japan's ambassadors. FDR knew that Japanese spies in Honolulu were sending Tokyo the exact locations of our ships in dock. It's now known that FDR drafted his Day of Infamy speech, first draft, on December the 6th. And you don't have to take the New American's word for it. You can read the book Infamy by the Pulitzer Prize winner John Toland. You can read Robert Stinnett's fine book, Day of Deceit. Even BBC has produced a documentary called Sacrifice at Pearl Harbor. It's aired on the History Channel and confirms everything we said in the New American. And here's a quote that you didn't see in my articles, because it came out after the articles. Here's one from Helen Heyman, daughter of Don Smith, director of the War Service for the Red Cross before World War II. Here's what she says, quote, from the Washington Times, quote, shortly before the attack in 1941, President Roosevelt called my father to the White House for a meeting concerning a top-secret matter. At this meeting, the President advised my father that his intelligence staff had informed him of a pending attack on Pearl Harbor by the Japanese. He anticipated many casualties and much loss, instructed my father to send workers and supplies to a holding area. When he protested to the President Roosevelt told him that the American people would never enter the war in Europe unless they were attacked within their own borders. He followed the orders of his president and spent many years contemplating this action, which he considered ethically and morally wrong. I do not know the Kimmel family. She's talking about Admiral Kimmel, Pacific Fleet Commander. I do not know the Kimmel family, therefore would gain nothing by fabricating this situation. However, I do feel that time has come for this conspiracy to be exposed, and Admiral Kimmel vindicated of all charges. In this manner, perhaps both he and my father may rest in peace. Unquote. Helen Heyman, daughter of Don Smith, director of the War Service for the Red Cross, World War II. I'd like to mention that the family of Admiral Kimmel did contact us at the New American and requested permission to use one of our articles in their own efforts to vindicate their father. And in fact, Congress has passed resolutions vindicating both him and General Short, the Army commander at Pearl Harbor, with only President Bush's approval for that to happen. One more example from history. Let's go back to World War I. At the time of World War I, people in Britain were told this. United States, too. They were told, you know, over in Belgium right now, German soldiers are bayoneting babies. Are you going to sit there and let that happen? And a lot of people said, no. I said, of course not. We're going to go to war. But you know what? After the war was investigated, it was found there was never a single instance where a German bayoneted a baby in Belgium. Simply fabricated by wartime propagandists who wanted to create a war psychosis. And how about the Lusitania? Lusitania was a British passenger ship, went down with 128 American passengers on board in 1915. American people were told this was a wanton act of cruelty by the Germans who wanted to slaughter innocent American women and children. It was the truth, though. The reason the Germans sunk that ship had millions of rounds of ammunition on it. And in order to conceal that fact, when the subsequent hearing was held, President Wilson ordered that the ship's manifest be hidden in the archives of the United States Treasury. The Germans attempted to prevent people from boarding the ship. They tried to take out ads in the New York papers, but the State Department intervened and held up publication until the day the Lusitania set sail. Prior to the Lusitania going down, Edward Grey, the British Foreign Minister, asked Colonel House, President Wilson's advisors, what would happen if a British passenger ship was sunk with Americans on board? And Colonel House replied, I should think that a wave of indignation would sweep through our country and we would be brought into the war. Now, you can read about that in the book called The Lusitania by British author Colin Simpson. Now, I bring this up because I want to point out that in view of the fact that we've been misled into war on a number of occasions, I think that we need to be cautious when we go to war and we're told we have to go because of such and such a reason. I'm not saying that this proves we're being misled right now, but I do think we should be cautious, and I think we should ask questions. As to what's behind here, is there an agenda? Well, it kind of looks like it, and I think that Ed did a pretty good job of describing it at the outset of tonight's talks. I think it's safe to say that what's going on has something to do with advancing globalism, because President Bush has been saying, has justified the action by saying we are enforcing UN Security Council Resolution 1441. But since when is it the duty of the American people to enforce UN Security Council resolutions? Another interesting fact that's come out is there's a plan to have the oil of Iraq put under UN control, which is certainly a first for the United Nations to be controlling the oil of a nation. There may be more to that, but you know what? I don't really want to speculate too much. Speculations aren't worth a lot. Speculations might hurt morale. And, you know, it took decades for the truth to come out about Pearl Harbor and the Lusitania, and maybe many years before we know everything about what might be an agenda taking place right now. But I do have one last concern I want to address, and that is in this whole war on terrorism, the Patriot Act and the Homeland Security measures that are being enacted. Because it would, these measures, these security measures, give our government unprecedented power to intrude on our lives, to monitor our email and to seize assets, powers that it's never had before. And if this war in Iraq, America's making a war right now without any overt act of aggression being committed against us by Iraq. Now, people might say, well, what do you call 9/11? But Iraq, we don't have definitive proof that they were behind that. Yes, they have links to Al-Qaeda, but so does Indonesia and Saudi Arabia and many other countries. If I was a Muslim right now, I would certainly perceive the United States as an aggressor in Iraq. And I would think that this war is likely to provoke acts of terrorism, which in turn would encourage stronger and stronger acts of internal security here within the United States. Now, it's interesting, getting back to the Council on Foreign Relations, who proposed the Homeland Security Department? Where did it come from? Interestingly enough, it all started with a group called the United States Commission on National Security, which consisted of 12 people, 9 of whom were members of the Council on Foreign Relations. They recommended what they called a, quote, National Homeland Security Agency. This is before 9/11. Interestingly enough, that's the exact phrase that President Bush used 9 days after 9/11 to describe the Homeland. He called it a National Homeland Security Agency. But it appears that the CFR, Council on Foreign Relations, is still making American foreign policy. Now, here again, I was talking at the outset about how the establishment's got conservatives figured out. I think they got us figured out on this one, too. They know how to appeal to our patriotic instincts. I mean, you got to support the Patriot Act if you're patriotic, right? But, I think it's even beyond patriotism and conservatism. I think they're also appealing to Christianity in this case. Because, Christians and Muslims are historically enemies. And I think that there's an appeal here that, look, you Christians, don't you know that these measures are going to take care of these Muslim extremists? I mean, those are your theological enemies. Shouldn't you be supporting that? And I think a lot of Christians kind of hop on the bandwagon for that reason, too, that they think, well, these measures are just going to be used on Muslims and not going to be used on us. Is that true? There was a column written in Newsweek by Anna Quindlen that I think we really need to pay attention to. The column was called The Terrorist Here at Home. Now, what terrorist was Anna Quindlen referring to? This is after 9/11 she wrote this. She said about the pro-life movement. Here's what she wrote, quote, there is no real ideological difference between these people and the people who flew planes into the World Trade Center. One of the leaders of Operation Rescue once sent his followers a letter that concluded, return to the training so God may use you. Sound familiar? Unquote. Anna Quindlen, Newsweek. Now, all through this column, Anna Quindlen interplayed these images of the World Trade Center bombers with the pro-life movement. Based on those statistics, you know what? You're safer working in an abortion clinic than you are working at a 7-Eleven. But all through this column, you could kind of sense this columnist for Newsweek salivating at the thought of pro-lifers being classified as terrorists. Because just think, then you could seize their assets, shut down their websites, detain them without trial. Now, I think a lot of conservatives are kind of comfortable with Homeland Security because they figure, well, hey, look, we got a Republican majority right now. It's very safe. You know what? But what happens if this sudden economic downturn, which certainly these bankers are capable of creating, supposing Hillary Clinton became president next time around? I venture a guess that Hillary Clinton and Anna Quindlen see eye to eye on a lot of things. Now, who do you think Hillary Clinton might classify as a terrorist under Homeland Security? Maybe some of us. Now, what's the hope in all this? Well, I do want to say that if you're not a member of the John Birch Society, I would recommend you join the society, which is really in the forefront of the fight against globalism and the American establishment. And I also like to recommend that you do subscribe to the New American, which is an outstanding magazine and had great articles on what's been going on in the world, and just terrific articles, and will really keep you informed. on what's happening. But I don't want to say that just joining the John Birch Society is going to solve all this. I consider the John Birch Society like an efficient, well-armed battalion. The only problem is it seems like the establishment's got about 100 heavy divisions. But I do want to say, I do want to say that ultimately it's going to be God who's going to do this for us. I think that ultimately we have to appeal to God and pray to God to help us, because I think we're really seeing something taking place right now that is really been prophesied in the Bible. I think we're looking at something of really biblical proportions taking place when we look at this New World Order taking place. Sort of seeing the grounds for the Antichrist, if you can accept that, being laid right now. But with God's help, a few good men can make a difference. There's many examples of that in history. One of my favorites is John Wesley. John Wesley, the famous Methodist preacher, was the 17th child of his mother. That's number 17. But, he preached throughout Britain. And, when he was a young man, immorality was rife throughout Britain. Profanity. But, he preached throughout Britain, caused the Great Awakening. With God working through him, the Great Awakening happened. Britain went into the Victorian era and knew the greatest period of prosperity and morality in its history. A few good men can make a difference. Is it hopeless? We know something. That question was put to a veteran combat soldier in the Review of the News a few years ago. Now, the Review of the News, for those of you who don't know, is the predecessor of the New American. It's called the Review of the News. And the editor at that time, Scott Stanley, asked this combat soldier, who's been in Vietnam, he said, look, looks like establishment about won the game. What do you think? Should people give up? Because that's what a lot of people are saying. Here's what the soldier said, based on combat experience. He said this. He said, look, when things look tough and it looks like you're going to lose, it's true. If you keep on fighting, you might lose. But you know what? If you give up, you are guaranteed to lose. So he said, don't you give up. So, for those words I leave you, don't give up. I thank you very much for your kind attention tonight. Appreciate all you good people that have come out here.